Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Simon Dubbins. Simon is Director of International and Research for Unite the Union in the UK, coordinating the European and international work of Unite across all its sectors. Simon has previously worked for the Graphical Paper and Media Union and was the head of international for AMICUS. He is also the co-convenor of the Freedom for Urgeland campaign and a patron and supporter of the Peace in Kurdistan campaign. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you, Connor.
So to begin, I wanted to first ask you a bit about your background. How did you become involved with politics and in particular with the trade union movement?
Yeah, well, look, I grew up, Connor, in a very political family, in the sense that my father was a senior official of the, at that time, the National Graphical Association. It became the Graphical Paper and Media Union. And when I was 12 years old, Thatcher, that wicked evil woman, came to power. And as you know, the 80s were an extremely turbulent time politically. So my father's union, which covered printers and the pre-press areas, always ran a closed shop. So one of the first pieces of legislation that Thatcher changed was to make that illegal. And there was a huge strike. I think it was 80-81. A very bitter one in Shars, and obviously in the family it was very present, and the phone was going all the time. We very much knew about it. That rolled into the miners' strike almost a year or so later, and as a young man I got very involved in that, collecting food every Wednesday, collecting food in the town every Saturday and attending the miners' support group in the evenings and so on. And then almost as soon as the miners' strike finished, the big Wapping dispute happened, which again involved the print unions. And that was another 12 months. We went down every week, at least once a week, to the picket lines. It was extremely violent. And obviously, the Soviet Union still existed at this time. So the whole political discourse was different, if you like. The left felt stronger, even though it was under attack. But as a young person, you get very politicized and become very involved in it, and you start taking an interest more and reading more and so on. So I worked then for a few years, and then got the chance to study at Strathclyde University, where I studied history and industrial relations, and really have never looked back since, and just been permanently always involved in the trade union and wider labour movement.
So as you were describing growing up in it, in being exposed to the political issues of the day, to the trade union movement, was it something that you were drawn to and knew that you wanted to become involved in from quite an early stage? Or were there ever other things that were a possibility or that drew you?
I think I was probably like a lot of young people, where you don't quite know what you want to do, but the effect of those strikes and being exposed to it, and you know, around the country, miners were placed in each town to help coordinate things, and you get the chance to meet people and talk to people in struggles, and you see the injustice of what was going on, the way that Thatcher was blaming the unions for everything, blaming the unemployed for being unemployed, not the destruction of their industries and communities. And, you know, it does politicize you, and you end up with that feeling that this is actually about the struggle of those that have very little against those that have it all, class struggle, if you like. And you know, you end up realizing that actually life is about the battle for justice, social justice and equality and so on, and they become extremely powerful motivating forces, and you end up seeing life through that lens. And for me, I can honestly say I think that is the most important thing in life, is the continual struggle of people for justice, equality, democracy. And as I've got older, I've obviously had the chance to see that in many, many more countries, and sometimes in much, much worse situations. And that in itself becomes an inspiration then to carry on. So yeah, I guess it's a product of sort of circumstance and the environment as well, Connor.
Yeah, as things go, determined by our conditions, or at least influenced by. Is a messy subject, sure.
As someone once said.
Yeah, exactly. And this is segues into the next thing I wanted to ask you. As I mentioned before, you're the director of international for Unite, and you have a long history of being involved with a wide variety of international issues. How did you become interested and involved in international issues, coming from this perspective, as you did with the you could say the domestic struggle in the United Kingdom? Was there something that led you to begin looking at international issues, or was that also something that was there from quite early on? So if you could say a bit about the path that led you to taking up an international view and wanting to become involved in that work, and a bit about the work and the issues you've been involved in thus far.
Yeah, I think, Connor, from a point of view of trade union labour movement, internationalism is one of its most core basic principles. And in the strikes and conflicts that I was mentioning, international solidarity from unions in other countries and so on was very present. I think it's well documented that the French miners provided huge support to the miners here and so on. But as you're reading and beginning to understand and, you know, be more aware of the history of our movement, you start to understand where Cuba fits into it and why in the struggle against imperialism that was so pivotal and so important and so inspirational. We had in the 80s, if you're too young probably to remember it at the time, Connor, but the anti-apartheid movement was hugely important for young people. Everybody saw that what was going on was just absolutely outrageous, and we all wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder. And that was to support, you know, comrades in struggle that were thousands and thousands of miles away, but it was very actual here. We had the struggle going on in Nicaragua at the time as well. And as you're kind of learning more and more about our movement's history, not just in the UK, but further afield, so you start to understand better about international politics and how international class struggle is important, all of these things. I think, though, the thing that really brought it more and more into focus was globalization was happening. Thatcher deregulated the exchange controls. It was about freeing capital to be able to roam the globe. And clearly that was happening. Multinational companies were becoming more important. Global finance capital was more important. The history of our movement is that nationalism is often its Achilles heel. We know it from the First International, the collapse of the Second, World War I, you know, the rise of fascism with its emphasis on nationalism and racism. So as the world's becoming and capital is becoming more globalized and seemingly unstoppably rearranging the world according to its interests, then it almost goes without saying that labor, trade unions, our class need to massively up their game in terms of international effectiveness, understanding, the ability to deal and control some of these forces. But it's not an easy thing. The trade union movement is pretty wedded to nation state structures. So actually, whereas capital has almost exited the nation state and is playing at this level, our movement is trapped often in the nation state. So it was also that thinking. And of course, with Europe and the integration that was going on in the lead up to 92, the single market, and as things developed, it was almost impossible to disentangle international and domestic issues, because lots of the best Labour's legislation at that difficult period was actually coming from Brussels, not the UK. So we had to be involved and capable of acting. So it's a product of all of that really, Connor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if I understand you, the very rich tradition of working class internationalism, which the trade union movement is, you could say, part of the material expression historically,
Yep.
and that you were led to this through that tradition and the developing, the changing world of globalization.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's deeply embedded in our tradition, and the more you get involved and read and understand things, you make the connections. But there was that added dimension, certainly from the 80s and 90s, the way in which the neoliberal deregulated global capitalism was really taking hold. And it was, how do we deal with that? How do we become more effective in trying to challenge that? And I still think, not to preempt some of the questions you may ask, but I still think there's, huge challenges in that. And there's still huge parts of our movement that want to hark back to the nation state as if there's a solution there. And I genuinely don't actually believe there is a solution only at the nation state level anymore.
Absolutely. Well, that is certainly a topic I would like to return to. But first, I wanted to ask you then, is there anything particular about Unite the Union, how you wound up here, and if there was anything about Unite that you felt best facilitated this work of internationalism? And in that context, if you could speak a bit about how you would characterize the position and role of Unite politically, both within the UK and Ireland, where Unite is also active, and internationally across its history.
Yeah, so I came to Unite through a process of mergers. I started with the Graphical paper media union. I think I went full time in 1997, but I'd been involved for many years before that, and had been living and working in Germany as well, and in Italy. But in terms of Unite, basically the GPMU merged with AMICUS, which was the engineering, and it had a previous merger with the white collar and other organizations. So GPMU went into a much bigger organization. Now, the GPMU was very involved internationally. We did a lot of work with South Africa, and particularly in Europe, but it was a much smaller organization. At the time we merged in 2004, I think we had something like 180,000 members. We went into an organization that was 1 million strong with AMICUS, and then we merged with the old T&G to make Unite. So I've kind of followed my union through the successive mergers and ended up in Unite and looking after the international work here. The big difference is this: Unite is so much bigger than the union that I originally came from. And on the basis of that, we have more resource and more ability to project ourselves internationally and across a wider range of issues. At the same time, the political weight of Unite is incomparable compared to the GPMU. GPMU was very powerful for a union of its size, but Unite is the biggest single affiliate of the Labour Party. It's a household name, and it's very visible. And we cover so many more sectors now, everything from aerospace to steel to automobiles, finance, healthcare, transport. And so there are so many more avenues and angles with multinational companies that we need to be involved with, linking up the shop stewards, but also it has given us that ability, particularly with causes like solidarity with the Palestinian people and with the Kurdish people. These are things that we are or have been able to do as Unite that I think it would have been much more difficult to do as a much smaller organization. So Unite is very visible, very important here in the UK, as you know, and internationally, it's very well known. We have a lot of relationships around the world. I think, you know, we are one of the biggest unions in the world. There are a couple of unions that have over 2 million members, mainly IG Metall and Verdi. There are some American unions that are up to that sort of level, but there are the number of unions within excess of 1.3 million members is very few. So internationally, we're quite pivotal, we're extremely influential, and we certainly use that as much as we possibly can for our membership, but also the wider international and trade union cause.
Mm. You mentioned the Kurdish movement as one of the issues that has been taken up by Unite. I wanted to ask how you yourself first became aware of the Kurdish movement, and what inspired you to become involved and take up this issue, if there was anything in particular that sparked your interest.
Yeah, I think, Connor, as I say, as a young person, when you're reading a lot and starting to go to education things in the union and labour movement, you start to become sort of vaguely aware of what's going on in Turkey and the Kurdish and the whole Urgeland history and the PKK struggle and so on. But I was never really that aware of it until I moved to Germany. I lived in Germany and worked in the Frankfurter Rundschau, the newspaper, in the production. And there, because there are so many Kurds and Turkish guest workers, as they originally came at, every time there was a May Day demonstration or some other demonstration, the Kurds would always be there, very organized in a block with their red flags and so on. And they're in force, and you start to hear, because of the tensions between some of the Turkish Kurdish community, you start to, okay, what is exactly going on? And I can remember it coming into certain meetings that were taking place in Germany and some, you know, anti-fascist events where there would be a Kurdish group there or a particular speech and so on. What I do remember very well was I worked with a Turkish, excuse me, I worked with a Turkish colleague. There were many Turkish colleagues in the Rundschau. And I always remember at his house when, at the time when Urgeland had been captured, which is some years later, I was back visiting, I believe. And I distinctly remember his mother, it came on television saying, yeah, they've got him. They will have to execute him now. Have to. And just being quite stunned at the attitude. First of all, as somebody against the death penalty and everything, that you would think at all that somebody should be executed in that situation was stunning. But it was also, I think, a reflection of the attitude of a lot of Turkish people at the time towards Urgeland and the movement. So I became much more aware of it then. But to be honest, with moving around and everything else that was going on, it was never heavily on the radar. I believe there were unions here that began doing some solidarity work earlier than we did, to be fair to them, particularly the teachers' unions and one or two others. But I think the turning point was 2014 and the battle over Kobani. And it was so obvious what was actually going on. Here was ISIS, one of the most vile organizations and political movements that we've ever seen, wreaking havoc everywhere, seemingly unstoppable. And this unbelievably heroic struggle going on in Kobani, where women are involved in it, the absolute antithesis of what these people were wanting, and putting up a heroic resistance. And then the news came through that Turkey would not allow supporting Kurdish fighters or, you know, people from Iraq to move through the country. And it was utterly outrageous. So we issued a first statement calling on the Turkish state to allow Kurdish fighters to cross and aid the struggling Kobani. So we started to get more aware and really to follow in a lot more detail. And obviously at this time, it's really the changing point when Turkey begins to disengage entirely from the peace process that existed, and effectively it became obvious that they were really supporting ISIS and they wanted the Kurds to be defeated. And you think, what the hell is going on here? So in 2015, Connor, we actually had a congress of the graphical workers in Istanbul. And Turkey it was a no-go area for many years, but it was felt that things were changing. The talks were on about joining the European Union, things were moving. So much of the trade union movement was beginning to hold events in Istanbul and Ankara, precisely because we were trying to hook up with the more progressive forces in Turkey. And just by chance, I was there on the day of the June 2015 election. Our Congress was taking place. And there was a real atmosphere amongst people about the breakthrough of the HDP. And we saw that as a really positive thing. They spoke very much the same language we did in terms of equality, justice, women's rights. And then the reaction after it, the way Erdogan breaks off the talks, begins the war again, holds another election, situation deteriorating massively, the attacks in Cizre, Sur district, Silopi, all of these places. And we got a small delegation to go out to visit. That was the first time that I'd really been to Kurdistan. And I can honestly say, Connor, having been to places like Colombia and Palestine and so on, I thought I was quite used to repressive situations, but I was absolutely stunned with what I saw in Sur district. And it made me understand that this was actually the Syrian civil war in Turkey, and that Turkey was a major actor in what was going on in Syria. And at the same time, despite the bombings, the killings, and what was a full-scale military operation in Sur, we met with the co-mayors of Diyarbakir and many other HDP people and women's activists and so on. And I was massively impressed with their political stance, their courage, their will to carry on despite all of this. And you simply can't leave an experience like that and say, okay, that was an interesting delegation, let's get back to London and forget it. So we vowed to do what we could. And a couple of months later, we talked a lot about how best to approach building solidarity. And it was decided the best way would be to focus around the figure of Abdullah Urgeland, his imprisonment. We felt and understood was the key to any future negotiated peace process. And yet he's been subject to 20 years of the most appalling isolation, most appalling conditions, which just on a pure humanitarian basis are absolutely disgusting. And we decided that we would try to focus it around getting the freedom of Abdullah Öcalan, because only with his freedom and his engagement will we ever be able to come to a solution in Turkey and in the wider region. So that was, sorry for being so long-winded, Connor, but that was kind of the background to how we got so involved in the Kurdish issues.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. It's important to have that background, and it segues very well. I wanted to ask you next about the Freedom for Urgeland trade union campaign, in which Unite the Union and you yourself have played a major role in establishing. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the process that led to the formation, as you were talking about setting up a bit of this background about coming to focus on Öcalan the figure. The process that led to the formation of the Freedom for Urgeland campaign, your involvement in it, and how you assess the successes and challenges it has had to date, and additionally, how you view the role played by the Freedom for Urgeland trade union campaign in the UK in the global efforts for freedom for Urgeland, such as those played by the international initiative Freedom for Urgeland Peace in Kurdistan in Germany.
Yeah, so once we'd come back, as I mentioned a moment ago, from the delegation, and really seriously wanted to do some more solidarity work in an effective manner, we launched the Freedom for Urgeland campaign April 2016 at an event in Parliament, where we had Cameron Yitzhak and Dilit Urgeland, the niece of Abdullah Urgeland, who at that time was a member of the Parliament. They came and spoke on the platform with us, and we launched it in the committee room in the House of Commons. It was interesting because the Turkish embassy and others were already trying to make problems and stop this happening. And sadly, Cameron, who spoke at the event, he was a representative of the DBP, the Party of the Regions at the time. He was arrested, I think it was 2 to 3 weeks after his return. And what he had said in the meeting in the House of Commons was being used as evidence against him as supporting terrorism and God knows what else. So it brought it home very, very clearly how dangerous some of this is for the individuals involved. We then went back to Turkey to observe his trial, where thankfully, in quite a rare instance, he was actually released after 6 months imprisonment, which doesn't happen that often. Kate Ozomo, the Member of Parliament, came with us as well. That was a real good lesson as well, Connor, in terms of the effect of having an international presence at trial, the effect it can have and the pressure it can put on and so on. So we basically, the GMB and Unite set it up, and we then set about really trying to get other trade unions to join the campaign. And there's a hell of an education job that needs to be done. Some people are vaguely aware of what's going on there, but are not in the detail. It's quite a, many people on the left grow up with Che Guevara, Latin American progressive revolutions and so on, but the Middle East is always more complicated and culturally seems further away. So we had all these obstacles to try and overcome. But to be fair, most organizations, when you speak to them, are very sympathetic. We had a pretty good take up. We started to hold fringe meetings at the TUC, at the Labour Party conference, which we've done ever since. And we've now grown to, I think we're on 15 of the UK's largest unions are affiliated and very supportive. We then had the big, we were trying to work out how can we get this message across in a broader way. And we looked at various events, and then we had, there were some meetings organised with the Durham Miners Association, and they agreed that for the, I think it was the 2018 festival, that they would have Freedom for Urgeland as the main international theme. I think that had a big effect. There's 200,000 people attend that. We had the chance to really get the message across, and Ibrahim Durgus made a fantastic speech on behalf of the campaign there and really brought the issue out. The following year, again, we were privileged to be the main international theme of the Tolpuddle March, the other big event in our annual calendar, with the same effect. And so slowly, the message is getting out. People are understanding it more. They're beginning to realize the importance. And what we kept stressing was the situation of Abdullah Urgeland himself, obviously, But what was happening to Kurdish people in Turkey, and not just Kurdish people, anybody that was progressive in favor of women's rights, democracy, the situation in Syria, the heroic defense, the way in which the Northeast administration, Rojava, was being rebuilt along the lines that we completely supported: inclusiveness, tolerance, rebuilding democracy. And I think the example of Rojava really does stun and inspire a lot of people that out of the ashes of such a dreadful conflict and dreadful abuses from ISIS and the regime and others, somehow these remarkable people had managed to build a new model and a new society. And that was incredibly inspiring. So by the 2019 TUC Congress, we had got motions passed. The whole of the TUC supported the campaign. And we were very, very proud, I have to say, that at that Congress, all 700 delegates stood up and held up a picture of Abdullah Urgeland and called for his freedom. So we feel as if we've got an established base. The organization's there. It never grows as quick as you want it to. Unfortunately, that's the nature of these things. And it's not been around as long as campaigns like Palestine Solidarity or Cuba Solidarity. So, you know, we've got some work to do, and a hell of a lot of work to do to build on it and, you know, implement it all properly. But I think for, you know, a campaign that's only 4 or 5 years old, we've really grown fast and already had as positive an impact as we probably could under the circumstances and with the resources we've got.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask too, another, of course, very important dimension for campaigns of this nature, as you said, one big part of it, especially in the early phase, is this big education initiative. It's just educate what the issue is and what's going on, who Urgeland is. And through the campaign, one dimension of this, of course, is how is trying to get it down into the grassroots levels of the trade union movement. And that, of course, requires a great deal of time and energy and patience to keep going and do that. And I'm wondering what you're able to say about how that process has been going thus far.
Yeah, look, it's not easy. You know, most people who are activists in unions are obviously representatives of their workforce, and they are dealing day in, day out with redundancies, problems in the workplace, everything else, which is extremely time consuming, and it's often in their own time. Then we're asking these people to get on board with this campaign, probably very often about which they are not massively informed. So it's not the easiest task, but I think through the process of the fringe meetings we've done, we've been put out some very good publications to try and simplify the issues and point out why it is important. We've had exposure at conferences and congresses as well with speakers. And you know, there's a great thing about the trade union and labour movement. Those that are active in it usually got involved because they saw injustices and things going wrong, and they were fighting for freedom, battles for equality and justice and so on in the workplace. They usually very, very quickly understand when other people are suffering the same type of abuse and problems, and recognize often that whilst they may have problems in the workplace, it's also, you know, it's very, very different to the type of threats, intimidation and violence that many others around the world are facing. So there is attraction, and they do understand it. I think it was helped as well, Connor, by the fact that they saw the Kurdish forces fighting ISIS. And for them, ISIS was an enemy. So these people were naturally seemed to be on the right side. And in the trade union movement, the real presence of women was a huge thing as well. So I think we have really made some progress, and there are some branches of our union, workplace branches, that have asked us to come and speak to their committees and members, where they've given us the chance to disseminate the information. And there is no doubt that we have managed to get a foothold. And some people, lay members, have been to Turkey to observe trials, have been, to other events and raised the issues internationally. But are we where we want to be? No. The ideal place is that every trade union member in the UK understands why the freedom battle for Abdullah Urgeland and this whole struggle is fundamentally important to them as well. But I think we've got a little way to go before we're there yet.
Sure, absolutely. And this goes back to the point we were discussing before about the significance and the beauty of this internationalist tradition of the trade union movement, that people are able to understand how the conditions that they face in their own context are connected to, and to understand how they are the same forces operating in a broader sense in these other parts of the world. So absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, just to come back to the international aspects of the campaign as well, Connor, we have been putting more effort into that. And we have been, we got French and German and Irish unions to join our online campaign during the beginning of the COVID crisis. And there's no doubt that there is an increasing awareness. We raise it in our European and global trade union federations, and we try to, build it as much as we can. There are some Nordic unions that have been interested and involved. But the reality is there are some complications. For example, German unions are always pivotal internationally at European level and global. They're very big, they're well resourced and everything. And they are also quite conservative on international issues. They are never, for historical reasons, in the same places we are on, for example, the question of Palestine, likewise with Cuba, with the history of East Germany. They're very nervous about those things. And of course, with a big Turkish community in Germany, they're always frightened of upsetting the Turkish members. So
there's very particular historical relationship between Germany and Turkey, back to the Ottoman.
Exactly. And it's not easy to actually get them to shift. That's a work in progress. Some of the other movements, the CGT, Comisiones, and those that have come from that part of the movement's tradition, have been much quicker to get involved and to support it, and have often done things themselves. I think there's no doubt it's becoming a bigger issue and more important, and people are understanding it better. But we've still got some way to go there as well. The other complication, Connor, is in the global federations, I'm just trying to choose my words carefully here. Some of the, let's say there are some unions that are very pro-Erdogan, and there are also some very conservative Turkish unions. And in the global and European federations, you can imagine, every time we try to raise this issue, they really create huge opposition and do what they can to try and stop it. That's frustrating. The flip side of it is, it's in there and it's being discussed, and people are actually talking about, well, why are you in such opposition to this? You're a trade unionist. This should be your struggle, and so on. So that, even though they're opposing it, it is nonetheless creating a bigger discussion about it as well. And I hope that over time we can break through in that.
It's very important. Absolutely. And you've been discussing, and you've mentioned a bit about the significance of Urgeland for the peace process, for the region, for the Kurdish movement. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that, in particular, how you see his significance. And I also want to ask how you, as a trade unionist, view the ideas and the practice of democratic confederalism, in particular the dimension of achieving a project for self-determination beyond the nation state, and in a form that is sometimes referred to as democracy against the state, which is an issue that we in Peace in Kurdistan are in particular focused on, the issue of self-determination in the 21st century, and how it relates to what you said before about the nation state, in your view, not being the way to a solution at this stage.
Yeah, so in relation to Urgeland, Abdullah Urgeland himself, personally, I think it's very difficult to exaggerate or overstate his importance. This is a man who not only built the Kurdish liberation movement and, you know, has invested his entire life in it and been its leading intellectual light. He's also, as we've mentioned before, indispensable to any peace process, not just for Turkey, but because of the way the Kurdish population is spread, it also in terms of Iraq and Syria and Iran and so on. So it's absolutely essential that he is allowed to play that role, and the Turkish state itself recognized that and engaged with him between 2013 and 2015. I know they like to try and erase that part of history, but that is the reality. And, you know, they're going to have to return to that path at some point, hopefully, and we need to build the pressure to get there. But Urgeland, I think, is remarkable in many ways. I mean, firstly, on an individual level, for anybody to have the strength of character to survive what he has done in total isolation over the last 20 odd years is astonishing. For him to have written the works that he has written and done the historical analysis and tried to then develop it theoretically and intellectually under those conditions is even more astonishing, and I think would put him up there with, you know, some of the greatest prison writers ever, like Gramsci and so on. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. I think what's also remarkable, Connor, when his movement originally was built in a quite traditional Marxist-Leninist approach, as far as I understand it, towards the question, and very much more on the sort of separatist right of nations to self-determination line. I think what has been incredible has been his ability to recognize the Soviet Union collapsed for whatever reasons, that maybe there were flaws in some of this approach, and maybe we do need to rethink it. And for the left, that takes an incredible amount of courage, and it also takes an incredible amount of intellectual depth and prowess to be able to identify it and articulate it and move things forward. And I think in doing so, what happened, in my view, to part of the left was we got trapped for a long period because the Soviet Union collapsed. We weren't, you know, quite sure where we were going in many respects. And I think Urgeland, to some extent, freed a part of the left from the straitjacket it had got itself into. And yet he's done it very much in a way which builds on the traditions, the foundations, the principles, and everything that was important to the left then as well. So I think he's actually brought the movement forward and into the modern age. And his whole approach, by putting the Middle East back to a large extent to the center of the analysis and understanding European nationalism, imperialism, and nation state politics from that view, is an astonishing achievement. It really is. So I think his role is not only essential, it's largely unrecognized, but in all facets, as a human being with strength and character, as an intellectual, as a revolutionary, as a fighter, he's a truly astonishing man that shouldn't be behind bars.
Absolute agreement. And I think this point that you are making is a really important one. The nature of his project and the historical conditions and juncture at which it emerges, this kind of questioning of, okay, what happened with the Soviet Union collapse? What happened with this prior area of anti-colonial movements? Why is it that they led to this point, that they didn't go where they were trying to go? And to me, exactly as you said, this moving forward, this re-examination is, in my view, really keeping in line exactly with the spirit of scientific socialism, of the tradition from Engels, that it is never about the particular, it is about the method, and then taking it up and coming to each new condition and each new stage anew to re-examine and re-question. And I think that this is exactly the nature of his project. And I think that another thing that I very much appreciate about Urgeland too is that he maintains that in himself, that he, in his writings, he expresses an awareness that he is very limited in what kind of resources he had access to be able to write the materials that he did, that he was, limited conditions of writing, so that he says quite explicitly his writings are only a first step and a contribution, a proposal, and that this process of questioning and development needs to continue to keep on going, so we don't get trapped in these straitjackets, like you said. But so I'm wondering how you view then this this proposal, the model, you could say, of democratic confederalism as an approach, both one developed specifically for the region of Kurdistan and for their conditions that they are in, but also one that has, as you said, been very influential and inspirational to many around the world, and how you view this as a proposal for where we are now as a global left.
Look, I think, well, a couple of things. Firstly, there is the theoretical framework and the historical analysis that he's developed, which, as we both seem to agree, has certainly helped us move forward. But we must also never forget that it is not just an abstract model. It's something that people in the Kurdish areas of Turkey that were under HDP control really actively implemented on the ground. The system of co-chairs is extraordinary, even from a West European point of view, to insist that there must always be a man and a woman co-chair for gender equality. The way committees are structured is really quite something. There was also, and I've seen it, several times I've been there, the inclusiveness of ethnic minorities or people with different religious beliefs, that they have just as much right to be included in the governance of the region and so on, is really impressive. Now, when you look at, that's in Turkey before the war really smashed everything to pieces and everyone was arrested and jailed and repressed again. In Syria, to manage to set up the structures in practice that Urgeland was pointed towards in his writings, and to see them working. I mean, I'm fortunate to have had the privilege to be there twice in two delegations and to have seen how their, the council systems are structured, very much bottom up and very inclusive, and it does work. That region was becoming more and more peaceful. People were happy with that. They wanted some stability. They wanted involvement in their lives. I think there's no better example of it than Afrin, which was a little oasis of people living together, different, ethnicities, religious beliefs, everything. Very much a welcoming place for refugees from the conflict further south. And it's functioning, working well, people are getting on with each other, and Turkey comes and decides we've got to put a stop to that for obvious reasons. So as a model, it can work in practice, and I think the limited chance we've had to see that would speak in favor of it being very positive. But here's the sort of flip side that I kind of wrestle with sometimes, well, not the flip side, I guess just an addition to it. The values and principles upon which it's all built are the values and principles of our movement. They are about equality, tolerance, peace, inclusiveness, women's rights, a place for everybody. So I kind of don't see any difference between what and the principles on which it's been built and where they're trying to go than where the union movement has been trying to go. Save for one absolutely critical point. This obsession with the nation state that has infected our movement historically as well. Many of these struggles, and I appreciate there's always the debate about progressive nationalism in oppressed countries versus, you know, domineering nationalism in Germany and UK and so on historically. But I've always felt nationalism is a poison in many respects, and it is the Achilles heel of our movement, certainly in Western Europe. That's why I was always pro-European integration. I understand all the arguments about a capitalist club and all the rest of it, but when this continent starts to rip itself apart on ethnic and national lines, we've seen where it goes twice in the 20th century, the First, the Second World Wars, and we see again the whole rise in the nationalist movements in Germany, UK, with the whole UKIP and Brexit movement, and Le Pen in France. And I think there's been a blind spot in parts of the left where visions of the nation state being the focus and the way to resolve everything, and what goes on outside that is for somebody else to sort out, is just profoundly dangerous, and it's mistaken. And by saying, look, we don't need to change the borders, we need to change what's being done, we need to change the form of governance, we need to change what we're looking at, we need to break with these ethnically homogeneous nation states, I think he is going exactly down the road that we need to go. And in fact, the only road we can go down if we want an inclusive society at peace and at ease with itself. I never really understood sometimes why parts of the left get obsessed with creating their own nation state, because I always understood the nation state as a system of class rule. So if within a nation state, whichever state that is, if there's a ruling class and a working class and the structures are there to oppress the working class and exploit them, how can a cry for freedom to set up a new nation state ever deliver anything if it's going to be within that same, you know, capitalist modernity structure where, by way of the global system, it will have to fit in with that pattern? So, look, I don't claim to be an expert at all on democratic confederalism or the finesses of it, but I have no doubt whatsoever that it offers a way forward and gets us away from talking just about bloody borders and ethnicities in that very limited, confined, negative way.
Absolutely. And this, I mean, there are many important points that you made there, but I think this last one too, that precisely one of the beautiful things I think about confederalism too, and something that Urgeland says is that he didn't invent it. You know, it's just that he's trying to articulate it for this time. Is that one doesn't have to be an expert. That or you know, when one gets into the issue of actually trying to develop it and build it, of course, there's going to be an endless amount of difficulty and nuance and everything, but it has this deep intuitive appeal, and it makes sense in some ways too, of just
absolutely
people can organize themselves. That makes sense. and
no, absolutely.
Very, very similarly to me, resonates deeply with the trade union movement of different aspects of society organize themselves for articulating their own interests and who they are in the context of a broader society, self-determination all the way down. Absolutely.
I would 100% agree with that, Connor. And you see, the other thing which we haven't probably touched on in terms of the wider Kurdish struggle and where Urgeland and democratic confederalism fit into it, and the whole evolution of the intellectual and ideological approach, is that I think the Kurdish movement is incredibly pragmatic as well, incredibly pragmatic in a very positive way. Yeah. So they don't, in my experience, is it's not hanging on to sacred texts and so on. There are guiding principles, guiding approaches, and it's under the umbrella of democratic confederalism, but the willingness and the ability to be flexible and to create, you know, structures that fit and work rather than it has to be this, it must be done in this way, I think is also a really, really important element within it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this in Rojava too, the willingness to engage in dialogue and compromise with other peoples in the name of inclusivity and creating a place where people can be themselves. As they often describe it, there is the space where we can compromise, and then there are red lines. And within that space where we can compromise, you know, people can have differences of opinion and they promote difference, and then just hold unity within diversity on those red lines. Certain
yes,
it goes too far. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in terms of, I think there's a maturity in northeast Syria amongst that movement, which is obviously all inspired by Urgeland's perspectives and writings and so on. There's a maturity born of the chaos of Syria and the need to be realistic. So I think the advances in women's rights are astonishing, but I'm aware that where they've tried to move the rights of women forward in certain areas, particularly some of the more conservative Arab areas, it's not been straightforward and it's not been simple. And yet the movement has also been very careful to not rush and just force it all through and create a backlash. I think there's been an amazing amount of dialogue and attempts to work with people to, it's still a red line, and quite rightly, and women's rights, you know, the basic fundamental rights and rights to participate can never be compromised. That's a red line. But getting from A to B, when you're coming out of the backcloth of a civil war and ISIS dominated areas and all of the conservative traditions, it's not as simple as just passing a law and suddenly it all changes. And I think that's what I think is some of the richness within that movement and struggle today.
So I think that's a very nice articulation of it, maturity. And as you, I think, rightly say, one that they're forced to adopt due to circumstance, they don't have a chance to survive. And I think that this point too gets at something that is perhaps one of the things that does need to be rethought from the classical left tradition, that there was almost a belief in the more programmatic and so to speak deterministic understandings of Marxism and historical materialism, that you can engineer a free society by force. You know.
Yes, I would 100% agree with that. I really think there are elements of that in the history of our movement without a shadow of a doubt. And you know, that it's the contradiction. There's that drive towards centralism, which is very much the old Marxist Leninist, or certainly the Leninist type of approach, and democratic centralism. And in terms of struggles and movements, I think that has been incredibly powerful, and it's welded together forces that have brought about important and great social changes. However, there is also no doubt that sometimes the centralism dominated over the democratic part of it. And I think that has, without a doubt, played a role in some of the problems that historically our movement has found itself in and been confronted with, I think, again, it's my experience of it, the limited experience I have of it all. I think there's very much an understanding that the democratic side of it is absolutely fundamental as well. And hence even the term democratic confederalism, with its emphasis on locality, decentralization, and all the rest of it, is extremely, extremely important, and something I think it doesn't do us any harm to relearn, re-emphasize, understand in that context, particularly as a program and strategy and way to move forward properly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's always such a fine line, a delicate balance. And when you are in conditions of war and revolution, of course, it is, you know, and there's no denying the very incredible tradition left behind from the leftist tradition, as you said, that this is a continuation of that and understands itself to be. But I did want to ask you to come to this, as I think it is a good segue to the trade union movement today, both in the UK and globally, the status of it and how you evaluate it. As you mentioned before, there has been a very seismic transformation for the entire global left in the collapse of the USSR, and how the left understands itself, both how it is materially organized, you can say, and then how it understands itself and where it's going. And as well, this a changing economy, a growing, sometimes referred to as the precarious sector or the gig economy and the rest of it, ununionized work and labor, transforming kinds of economy, deindustrialization in some parts, exporting of things. So I'm wondering how, in this sense, how you look at the trade union movement today, how you evaluate it and its prospects, and in that context, the global left and the prospects for internationalism, with a changing meaning of working class today, and what collectivity of peoples and internationalist struggle might mean today towards a global approach, as we've been speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. Connor. Look, if I kind of look across the global trade union movement today, there's no doubt, you know, in terms of numbers in the level of organization, we're down on where we used to be, particularly in the Western industrialized countries. Yet, you know, we also have to keep that in perspective, because we had 50% of the work, we had 13 million members in the UK when Thatcher came to power. Today, we're just over 6 million, or round about 6 million, so we're half. Much of that was due to the deindustrialization, which was a deliberate strategy. They closed the coal mines, they shut the shipyards, all the sectors where people were organized. And what has replaced that has only been very precarious work, which doesn't lend itself to the same collective mentality, often not living tightly in the same communities as the past. And that picture you can repeat virtually everywhere, starting from different bases. Even the Nordic countries, which had massively high levels of membership, they're still very high, 90% and so on compared to here, but they've certainly been dipping. The US as well, France and so on. I think the other side of it, though, is the movement has definitely focused more on organizing again, much more. There's much more resource in there. There are some huge battles going on, not always successful, as we see in the States, but people are trying to organize, trying to find new ways of doing it, because younger people communicate differently today, as we know, and it's not always easy to get their attention, to develop the collective mentality and so on. All of that said, globally, I think we definitely are more effective at trying to take on some of the big global companies that are abusing human and workers' rights. You know, they may operate relatively okay in Europe, they go to Latin America or Africa and they behave like some of the worst gangster companies about. So I think we're getting better at that. But the problem is when you know, to do that, you need resources and you need structures, and international work for the average member can often feel quite far away, unless they're in multinational companies, and then it makes a lot more direct sense as well. So we got a lot of challenges and difficulties, but I'm not pessimistic in that sense, Connor. Things are very, very difficult. There is a surge in nationalism again. There's no doubt about that. That, I think, is sapping our energy and clouding a lot of people's judgment on some of these things. But we're still here. We still organize really important sectors of the economy. They still feel the need to talk to us. We can still cause disruption and difficulties if they are continuing to abuse workers' rights and, you know, attack paying conditions and so on. So we're there. And you see elements even in the United States with the defeat of Trump. There is an atmosphere in the American labor movement at the moment that, look, we've got a window of opportunity here. We really need to do some stuff, try and get improvements in legislation. Biden, with all of his shortcomings internationally, I think is probably more progressive than the Labour Party in the UK at the moment, in his attitude towards union rights, social welfare and all the rest of it. So they're in quite a good place in terms of the optimism that they're feeling at the moment. And then, you know, we've had struggles, haven't we, in South Africa. There's lots of problems in South Africa, but it's only a short time ago that they threw the yoke of apartheid off and liberated themselves. So, you know, we have to look at it with that longer sweep and longer history. In that sense, I think we're still very present. There's still a lot of people that don't like that and would rather that we weren't present at all. But they've been right in the death of the trade union and labour and working class movement ever since it was initially set up with a very clear objective. So I think we're, a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties. The world of work is changing. The whole issues of just transition, the greening of the economy, climate change, precarious jobs, there's a massive number of problems. And COVID on top of that, which once again, they're trying to make working people pay for, just as they did in the time of the financial crisis. But have we got a basis there? Have we still got the structures in place? Definitely. We are absolutely still here. We see it day in, day out. My organisation has always got conflicts in the workplace where we're trying to support our members in their struggles, usually at the moment to defend their pay in terms and conditions. And despite all of that, and despite all of the problems of COVID, I still think there is an understanding from most of the movement. We've got to be more international, not less. There ain't no solution just in the nation state. We cannot avoid the fact that global capital exists, finance capital, multinational companies. And until we deal with that, trying to put a band-aid over it in the nation state is not really a particularly clever long-term strategy. I don't know if that answers your questions though, Connor, because I was jumping around a wee bit there. So apologies if it wasn't very clear.
I did actually want to pick up on this last point to ask if you could say a bit more, because you'd been mentioning before about how nationalism and the fixation on the nation state is something that has permeated into the trade union movement to a certain degree. And as you were just mentioning, that there is this growing understanding as corresponding to a growing reality of a globalized capital. And I'm wondering then in that context how you see the pathways for cultivating an international outlook and international forms of connection and international modes of struggle between different places, trade union movements in different countries. I mean, of course, there are the federations and things like this, but yeah, if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think when I say it's, got into parts of the trade union movement, I suppose here I'm speaking particularly in terms of the those parts of the movement that supported the Brexit campaign and all of that, which I appreciate there was a left argument, a left Brexit that was being put forward. But for me, I always thought it was really confused thinking and not very clear, as well as, trying to kind of pander to part of the class that unfortunately has been sucked in by some of those arguments instead of trying to challenge it. Now, you can't, this is not, it took the form of Brexit here, but it takes the form of the AfD in Germany or Le Pen in France and so on. And we have to recognise that we have members that find that argument attractive, or, the Britain first. It's why in the States, there are unions that have to be very careful because they know there's a chunk of their membership that are ardent Trump supporters. And I think it's really, really dangerous, Connor. And I think we have to have the courage to have those arguments, even though they're difficult, even though they're more complicated. Because once our movement ever starts sliding into the belief that stopping immigration is the answer, or putting the borders back up is the answer, or somehow because they are English or whatever, they suddenly have more in common with English bosses than they do with German, French, or South African workers, is a myth. And for me, it's a cancer. And we really need to battle that very, very strongly. Yeah. In terms of how, at the same time, there is a whole chunk of the movement that recognizes, because they're in multinational companies, because they have to trade the goods that they produce upon which their jobs depend, are sold as exports, and they depend on that interaction and interconnectedness of the economy. So I think you've got those two strands at play. And I think the more open-minded progressive stuff is still dominant in our movement. But I felt that it's slid in the last few years, particularly, obviously, in the aftermath of the Brexit stuff. And if you ever, we have it here on the island of Ireland. You mentioned that my union represents members in the Republic and in the North. Look at what has happened since the Brexit vote and the effect that it's had by reintroducing questions of borders again. You immediately inflame questions of identity and belonging and all of these things. And yet we had a situation, by no means perfect, with huge problems still, but at least the killings were so much less, the violence was so much less. And Connor, I'm not anywhere near as expert as you, but I look at what happened in Northern Ireland, or on the island of Ireland, how they resolved and the agreement, and I see huge elements of democratic confederalism in that. The way the cross-national institutions were built, the way power was shared, that is exactly, in my view, the type of approach that we need, so we can get away from this nonsense of ethnicity, religions, and all of this, and start recognizing each other again as human beings and working people that should stand together to try and create a better future and a better society. And there's no doubt that that strand of the movement is still very strong and very much alive, even if it's been under pressure. And I think that should give us optimism to move forward, but we got a lot of work to do in order to get there still, Connor.
Absolutely, absolutely. Of course, there's so much more that can be said about all of this, but I think unfortunately we have run out of time, and that is a very good note to close, I think. First, thank you so much for speaking with us, Simon. And are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
No, I mean, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Connor. It's always good. It forces me to think some of these things through in a bit more detail as well. The great difficulty is obviously when you're involved day to day all the time, it's difficult sometimes to order your thoughts and really work things through. So I really appreciate the conversation as well, Connor, and all the work that you and others do. I think it's great that you're trying to make the collection and gather people's thoughts and perspectives on things and see where we go from there. But no, it's a privilege to have the chance to talk with you as well, Connor, and I hope we can again in the future.
Thank you very much, Simon. I too am very grateful for everything that you do, all of your work, and the great importance of the trade union movement. And people like yourself keeping it alive. And I'm glad that it was helpful or enjoyable for you. So I'm happy. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. All the best, Connor.
Bye-bye.